Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the fifth of CASL Grand Prix conversations. This week we have Amin from History Department. He tells us about his external funding experience, things that worked for him and things that did not work for him. And we learned a lot from all the other PI's conversations. So we will have more information from Cam on the more social sciences side of the story, but it will be relevant to all of us again. So without further ado, I turn it to you, Cam.
Hi, thank you, everyone, all of you now and forever who will be watching this. So I think I'll start with a screen share where I'll show some projects and then give a little bit of the kind of a grant history behind the projects. And the point I want to make today is that the grant writing process and the actual funding process relative to what actually gets delivered is a tricky one, and that there's a lot of failure that you need to budget for in your approach, and that even when you have failure on the primary funding objective, it's possible to keep momentum on projects that matter to you. So let me do the screen share now, just 1 second. Okay, so what you should see, let me know if you can, is a book in the library. It's an ebook, and this book, the work for this book was funded by an NEH, I think it was called National Education Projects Grant that I was successful with at the end of the last century. We got funded at the beginning of this century, and the funding was for 2 or 3 years, I think. And then the book came out a couple years after the project. And why do you want funding of this magnitude? It was $250,000, and the reason that I needed the funding, and this is something to think about with your projects perhaps, is it was a complicated machine. There were lots of contributors. There was multiple institutions involved. And so one of the things you want a grant for is to give you resources to manage the complexity of a project. And just to give you a sense of how complex this, I mean, it's a book. It's like, so what? It's a book. Well, true, I grant that, it's just a book. But let me give you a look at the table of contents. And you can see it was a thematically organized collection. Every source was a primary source that was either translated for this collection or adapted from some other collection. It covered the Middle East, sort of broadly speaking, from the late 18th century to the very ends of the 20th. And it included both qualitative and quantitative information. And the quantitative economic data was done by one of Ilir's former colleagues, actually, for this collection. And so to manage something like this required funding for my time and for the resources that went into putting this all together. So that was, I think, the success story. But before it was a success story, it was a complete failure. The first iteration of this grant, my friends and I, my co-editors, Benjamin Fortin and Elizabeth Frierson, we conceived of this project in 1996 when we were still graduate students. And our plan was that if we got jobs, one of us would try and be the PI and the other ones would be kind of co-PIs wherever we wound up. And a couple of years later, we all had jobs and we all had places that could serve as host institutions. Ours was the only institution that made sense because Ben was in London and Elizabeth didn't feel like her institution was the right place. So I was the PI. They were co-PIs. And our first attempt was a failure. We thought we made a good case for it, but it was shot down by the reviewers. And so, yes, we were pretty upset when that happened, but the program officer included me on the next round of reviews. So I got to serve as a reviewer of grants. So I could get a sense of not so much other projects that I should emulate, but what the decision-making process is on the funder side. And that was very useful because mostly, you can anticipate non-experts who are nonetheless have PhDs in something, so they think they know everything. So you got that problem. You have all the kind of biases you're going to see with any kind of project, things that people think are important. And so the needle you're trying to thread is how to be respectful of the fact that some people have no idea what you're talking about, and you have to explain to them, but also make the case for, really what is special about the efforts you want to do. So that was illuminating for me to how to recalibrate. The project's conception didn't change, but the way we wrote up the grant did change somewhat, and we were successful with the second application. So that's the sort of the first kind of success story born of failure. How did it serve my career? Well, getting the grant was sort of icing on the cake of my P&T case. Nobody cares in my unit if I make it a grant or not for P&T, but it was one of those things I said, oh, and he seems kind of smart. He got a grant. So, I mean, the idea was good, I thought, but it was better when it had $250,000 attached to it, in other people's view. That's when it became a good idea. And then it helped me in my next transition to promotion, because when the book came out after I was promoted, it became one element in my promotion case. So that's the way in which this thing happens. But you have to recognize that it was 2005, 2006 before the project saw the light of day. So 10 years from conception to deliverable. And so thinking about the broad time horizon. Okay, so that's the success story. Let me take you to another project that was a minor success story in terms of grant writing. This project is the Michigan-Iranian American Oral History Project. It was initially given some funding from the local NEH, sort of Michigan Humanities Council Heritage Grant, and that was for the recording of the interviews. For the creation of this site, which we're going to announce, I think, officially in maybe a week or so, I was not able to get external funding, but we had internal funding that helped with that. And there are several things that helped me put enough money together to work on this. And the interviews are recorded over like a 2-year period, but it's only now that we're getting to the point where we can display them the way we want to. And that's because of the complexity of the tools to display. I'll give you a sense of what I mean. There's 3 software packages that went into designing this website. One is Omeka S, which is just for the display. But then when you actually go to an interview, for example, this is put together with something called the Oral History Metadata Synchronizer. And when you go to the interview, they get a pop-up. I'm not sure if you can see the pop-up. Let me see. You probably cannot see the pop-up. Let me redo the share so you can. Stop share, screen share, okay. And what the OM software, now you should be able to see that the pop-up. What the software lets you do is it lets you navigate to a particular part in the oral history interview. And in addition, there's a little bit of information about each segment. You can navigate right to the segment. We have it also in Persian. So for those people who want to look at this thing in Persian, the transcript is also in Persian, but it's also in English, and you can search in both languages. So using this tool took time for us to learn and to train students, and that was what some of the funding was about, was getting folks to index it. And then the subtitling, which is not displayed here, that's a separate software package, and that's students. So these smaller grants did not buy much of my time, but they bought student research time. And that was crucial, because when we tried to scale up to a bigger grant with NEH again, we got shut down. We got shut down on this project and on another project I'm going to show you. Let me stop this and do another screen share with something else. This is, I'm not sure if you can see this. Can you all see like this Persia House in Michigan page now? Okay, so the key thing here is not the actual text. This text is a newsletter done by an Iranian American organization in Southeast Michigan. It's like 20 years. What we wanted to do, because they already have an archive of it digitally, the organization that produced it, we wanted to create a searching tool for it, a bilingual searching tool. We didn't have one, so we wanted to build one. So that's a software development thing. And we got local funding for that. I think it was a campus development grant, but we could not successfully translate that into a NEH. We've tried 2 times with NEH to kind of get this tool, and we did not get it. So, but fortunately, if you allow enough time, we've actually gotten this software, which is called the Multilingual Indexing and Software and Search Interface, or MISI. You'll see in the top, I think, right of your screen, powered by MISI. MISI is a software that makes this particular database work. It lets you search in English and in Persian, but it doesn't have to be English and Persian. It can be Dutch and Portuguese. And if you search in Portuguese, but your source is Dutch, it'll find it'll go out to a translating API, and it'll find the translated version of your Portuguese inquiry, theoretically. We're using it for this one sort of demo project. The point is we could not get a big grant funding to support this. So it had to be done with sort of local resources and over time, working with librarians and student coders from the engineering department. And we're at the point now where the software behind this tool is going to be released, we think, in March as an open access software. And we're exploring with the Office of Technology Transfer certain maybe business models or other kinds of things to do with this software. And that's been kind of exciting. And that was built around developing a resource around for the study of Iranian Americans, because the people I was interviewing for my other project, many of them were involved in the organization that produced this newsletter, which when I looked at it, had a lot of interesting kind of social information. And although it was on a website, it wasn't in any way searchable, or we wanted to make something searchable. So it'll eventually become part of Mardigian's digital collections. And so with both the oral history project and with this project, the effort to get big grants failed. They were very time consuming and they failed, but with the local resources and with the allowing of more time for things to breathe in terms of the work process, over the time, 2-3 years versus say 1 or 2, or 3-4 years instead of 2 or 3, you can keep momentum on your project. Now that these projects are at a different stage where the oral history project is going to be displayed, where the MISI software is going to be more like a complete package, and we're kind of beta testing it with users. We may get new grant ideas to build on from there, on how to find other partners to work with, not outside of Iranian studies, outside of even maybe university work per se. But that is the other fundamental reason why you want grants. Grants facilitate collaboration. I wouldn't be working with students and librarians and colleagues on other campuses in the same way if I hadn't gone through these grant proposal processes, and even the failures have led to me moving into projects that put me in contact with other researchers outside my field. And that was something that I wanted professionally. I was sick of doing what I was doing, and I wanted to work on projects with other people outside of my own area of expertise, but still using my expertise where appropriate. And so that's the other reason why, even if you fail in the effort with those grant proposals, which are time consuming and annoying, it can still move your overall career and research agenda forward. So that is the tour.
Thank you, Cam. That was super helpful. I really enjoyed your remark about you submitted one grant. It did not work, but you were invited to serve on the panel. I remember the first time I was invited to an NSF panel in DC. I came back home and I wrote down my notes to keep it for future reference. And I remember titling it Moses coming back from Mount Sinai. It was that kind of an experience, because not only how you write your future proposals, but it helped me to understand all the decision-making process going on there. It made a big difference. And I know some organizations solicit reviewers. You don't have to be someone receiving an award from solicitations. You can go and see if they are inviting reviewers, and you can submit your name or email address to be a potential reviewer. Can you talk a little bit more about that experience, your review experience, and how it changed you said a few things, but elaborate a little bit more on that?
Well, this is something that you probably experience in almost any kind of peer review process. It's sort of like imagine a peer review process by committee where you see everybody and you're one of the kind of collective peer reviewers. So imagine that dynamic, right? And as much as everyone wants to be, neutral on what good research amounts to, because you have a different mix of people are going to go, in the case of NEH, they're gonna move in directions that they're more familiar with. And that's one of the things that it became very important for me to understand, is that when we're working on a project that is new or new to us, but definitely new in that sense, we are dealing with a mindset often of people who are not familiar with what's new, and they don't value what's new. They value what's familiar. So what the needle you have to thread is how do you connect the new thing where you don't know how it's going to turn out. You don't know what the results are going to be. You don't know what the applications will be. It's an open query. You don't know. But how it ties to existing the existing bodies of work that are out there. And that can be really annoying because to some extent, for example, the oral history of Iranian Americans in Michigan, there's no standing research on Iranian Americans in the Midwest, right? There's a couple of articles out there, different states. It's not a thing. Now it is, it will be once this thing's up. But because it was like that, it was that new, there was no way I could connect to a larger project easily. And similarly with this bilingual stuff, most things are not interested in what small collections with bilingual content. Most things are dealing with maybe translating from one language to another, or just accepting that it's going to be English, or it's going to be Arabic, it's going to be one language, and that's all we're working with. And the business of translating back and forth is not apparently something that people have been puzzling over or care about that much, because all the and so making the case for why this is useful was trickier. So that's the other thing, is how do you sort of make the case for why it's useful? Because on the one hand, there's a kind of an originality they want to see. On the other hand, they don't want it to be anything too weird that they can't relate to. And that's the drag of it all. It's very hard. If you're really doing what you want to do, what you're interested in, a reality you may have to accept is that nobody else is interested in it. And you have to kind of make a virtue of that in your proposal. Show, if you can, what lines of inquiry it might intersect with, what it might broaden out, how it could be useful beyond your own narrow set of questions, maybe from the reviewer's perspective. I got a sense of that, because the question that would come up was like, how does this help? And it's a really annoying question, but how does this help the field of humanity? How does this help humanities? That's a very, maybe it doesn't. I don't know. I mean, it's a very, you don't want to think that it comes down to something that's very kind of almost like a branding question, but that's almost like, is this humanities anyway? Is this history? Is this science? I mean, that kind of stuff, that'll be there. I don't know in the technical fields, what is the equivalent of that? I do know that in Iranian studies, narrowly, or Iranian history, for example, there are certain things that have got a lot of attention, and that's also where a lot of attention tends to go. So the Constitutional Revolution, the Islamic Revolution, if you're operating on things that are less sort of well-studied or less of interest, there's always going to be this question of how is it relevant to the field, because the field isn't paying attention to it. So it's a bit of a bind. So you have to find that sweet spot where what you're doing is new, but it's not, unrelatable. That's always the I think the needle you have to thread. And sometimes you're better at that than other times.
Yeah, thank you. Before I turn it to our audience for questions, you talked a little bit about competitions at the national level, submitting proposals to these organizations where someone from California, New York, Florida is also submitting. You talked a little bit about internal things where UI, Antonios, Jay, and Ilir, and others, we compete with very limited resources on campus. How about in between? Since your work is relevant to folks living in this area, do you have connections with foundations, groups of people? What's the view of them on your work? Do you get support, funding, either financially or in other means to support your projects? Well,
I think when I first got funding from the Michigan Humanities Council, which was the first bit of funding we got to do the oral histories, that's been an instance where the newness was a value. There had been nothing done. The ground floor opportunity was really of interest. And there was a lot of things I had to do for that grant that really weren't what I was interested in doing. That's the other thing. Sometimes you have to do some stuff with the grant because the grant's has a public education component or a survey component that you don't care about, but it's part of what they will fund. So you have to add some pieces to your project that are a distraction from your own research interests. So there's that. But when I went back for more funding from Michigan Humanities Council, it was a tougher slog. In fact, it was unsuccessful because I wanted to broaden and deepen the work we had been doing, but they were looking more at that point for things that were about public engagement. how do I bring this thing into like an exhibit, or how do I make it a lesson plan, or how that kind of stuff. And that was not what I was interested in doing with this work. There was a lot of work that I thought had to be done to make it more discoverable, accessible, relatable, analyzable, and then to actually do more interviews and more analysis. That's where I wanted to go with it. And Michigan Humanities Council is not that kind of thing. Now, where did the networking come from then? Because there has been some, and that has come mostly through my gradual work with the Michigan Oral History Association. I wound up on the board of that. Our campus hosted a conference where my project and other people's project, and that is becoming maybe a thing. Because one of the things we all realized in that group is that our individual oral history projects may not have enough power to pull in big funding. But if we had a consortium where we tried to figure out, okay, what can we do with this sort of collective effort around oral history, where there's multiple institutions, that's the collaboration piece. Maybe a grant that involves our campus and 2 or 3 other campuses and maybe one organization around oral history, maybe that would be more powerful. That is something that in NEH terms, they claim is a powerful thing. In other words, that's a value. If you have multiple institutions contributing and they're bringing something to the table, and it'll be this thing where it's going to have a broader impact because of multi-institutional collaboration, that is something that can add value to your grant proposal from the NEH perspective anyway, and other funders as well. That it's not just about your little sandbox, it's about other things. The thing is, that takes time to cultivate that. I mean, my relationships with Michigan Oral History Association colleagues are just a couple of years old, and everyone's got their busy areas, and the other area of collaboration that's happened that I'm going to be learning more about next year is Iranian diaspora studies, which is more of a thing than it used to be. There's a center for that now at San Francisco State. And my work in this area of Iranian American stuff, which I was working mostly on Iran properly. I wasn't doing diaspora studies in any way before. But that work is eventually, I'm going to be on an advisory council, I think they call it, for the Center for Iranian Diaspora Studies. Starting next year, we're going to be doing some stuff to kind of help that center grow. And so that's another area of collaboration that has produced some, professional networking possibilities that may ultimately lead to research projects. And the other thing is, there are questions that come up as you're doing, whether you're doing the work with the software engineers or doing work with oral history, that had me asking questions that are just outside my lane. For example, in oral history, there's this best practice of you're trying to bring things up that will elicit more recall, more sharing. So pictures from the past or something. And there's been a little bit of, impressionism about maybe sense memory. What did you see? What did you smell? What did things sound like back when you were a kid, or whatever it might be? And we had some M³ funding to do some pilot studies of if we had an event and we had people watch it and we asked sort of sensory memory kind of questions instead of more like narrative episodic kind of questions, that we get any kind of difference in how people responded. It was a very, very preliminary kind of thing. But I became very interested in the question of, does it matter if you ask a question? I mean, is there some empirical way of knowing if it's got value beyond what people say? But so I began thinking about people who could scan brains while they're being asked questions about sense memory. So that made me think about, work with, neuroscientists and psychologists and so on. And I was, before COVID blew up my sabbatical along with everybody else's, among the things I was hoping to do was connect up with one of our psych professors here who was doing that kind of research. I have to get back in touch with him, actually. If he's still here, I don't even know. We restart that, because that would be a whole other field where I will definitely be the least expert person on that research team. I will have content expertise. I'll have an oral history project where I can apply what we learn, but I don't know how to scan people's brains or interpret that stuff. That's going to be where I'll be like a junior partner on that. And that's the other thing, is if you want to do new stuff, sometimes being the least smart person in the room is the role you have to choose.
That's great. Thanks, Cam. Any questions from anyone in the audience?
I'd love to ask a question, maybe two, of Cam. So question number one would be, I have sometimes heard from people with experience in grant writing that a grant writer needs to focus, or needs to actually write for 3 audiences. One would be the program officers, the second would be the primary reviewers, and then the panelists. What's been your experience with that?
Well, I would say that you have to think of those things as sort of multiple data points, right? So you're going to get, I've always benefited from working with program officers, but they're also they're trying to read the tea, they're doing criminology as well. They're trying to say, well, I think people will want this, or they may have their own thing that makes sense to them, but because
they're not reviewing it, right?
Right. For them, success is projects they work on get well rated and get funded. That's what that's I'm not sure they get a commission on that or anything, but that's one of their metrics of success. So how many projects do they advise on that got funded, that produced successful stuff, right? So it is always in your interest to work with a program officer where you can, and to listen to the point where this is where I struggled. This is the part that I definitely struggle with. When the program officer is not getting it, how much of that is them and how much of that is you? And the answer is it's you. But that's a very difficult thing to deal with in the moment. Either your idea is not as good as you thought it was, or you're not expressing it as clearly as you thought you were. And if you kind of step away from the fact that, why isn't this person understanding me? What's wrong with this person? It's like, maybe it's not them. Maybe you're just not that clear, man. So then you feel like you're the program officer, you're seeing the project the same way, and you feel like, oh, great, this will definitely go well with the review. Well, in 3 out of 4 cases, the answer was no. The panelists did not see it the way the programming officer and I did, and only in one case, where it definitely ruined me for all further grant writing, because I had this big success early, and now everything looks like I can't even get a regional hit. So. So focus on the project, not the funding. The funding is to serve the project. Do a project you're interested in. That way, if the funding stuff doesn't go well, which it often won't, it sucks, but you can keep moving on your project. You want to think about how you can keep a project alive with minimal resources and what progress you can make, and then where that can then lead you to maybe a different conceptualization of external funding. Because external funding, I also want to say, grant writing is. Every grant I ever wrote was an article or a didn't write in terms of time, right? It was a chapter I didn't finish. It was a research trip I did not take, right? That's the scale of commitment for a big grant. You have 6 months, a year of your life, professional life, that was going to go into the parts that were going to be researchy is going to go to that. And this is, I'll put this on tape. Our campus does a crap job of recognizing that. Okay, it's not that we should give people money for writing failed grants. No, but there is a time cost, and I think it's easier for me to take my lumps now when I'm a full professor, when frankly nothing matters to my career. When I was an assistant professor and I wrote that grant, Ilira, you may remember Brooks, right? He said, "Man, don't do that, because I'm not going to be able to promote you with that. And if he doesn't get it and the book doesn't happen and your other book doesn't come out, well, you're just there with a whole bunch of grants that you wrote that went nowhere, and you'll just be a tragic failure." He didn't quite, I'm being more poetic than he was. He just said, "Don't do it." I think something like that. But I was stupid and young, and I didn't really think of how difficult it was going to be. And it was a near miss. My book was, for reasons I couldn't control, delayed. My ability to pivot and take care of it was weird, because the grant bought me a lot of time. And when you get your time bought out, it doesn't only go to the grant. A lot of it goes to the grant, but it also gives you more time. So I had more time to react to the weirdness around my publication that was the book. But things were a lot closer than they were supposed to be. When I sent the grant off, I thought I was well on my way with the book. That was going to be the P&T book, right? So that's the thing. I think we have to find ways to capture the uncertainty of the grant writing process, the time-consuming part of the grant writing process. And there are some metrics that I think could be useful. How did your grant get rated? Because NEH will tell you, you'll get the scores back. So if you got something back that basically everyone in the panel said, "This is crap," well, okay, you're not going to get credit for that effort, But if you get, there's a really big category of NEH where you have a highly rated project, but there's only X amount of dollars to go around. And if they have, 15 highly rated projects and 16 well-rated projects, if you get an A or a B, sometimes if you get an A, you won't get funding. But knowing that it was a quality proposal, I think is of value. And so that's a way in which our university could, find a metric that would, I'm not sure how people will credit stuff like that, but if we want it to happen, I think it's one of the things we have to deal with. The other thing that has been a perennial problem, it happened with the big grant, it happened with the smaller grants, is post-award support. Post-award support remains a challenge. And if you're a PI for a grant, another part of your research life and everything life that will go away is the time you spend dealing with administrative stuff. Part of that is necessary because it's a complex project where you're coordinating a bunch of people on the project, but then there's this other stuff where it's, especially with external, it's much easier with internal. In fact, that's one of the reasons I think twice before externals, is because externals bring this whole other world of hurt in terms of time that, of course, no one's going to credit, right? No one's going to care about. No one wants to hear you bellyache about your big grant, right? Believe me, nobody wants to hear that. But it's just a fact of life that you'll be spending time always right before your weekend, always right before your holiday, trying to sort out some idiot query from somebody in Ann Arbor about your grant. And from your perspective, they're probably right to ask the question when they ask it, but that's just part of the piece as well. You have to think, is this project something that I want to invest administrative time in, like I would if I were a program representative or department chair? Because that is a time commitment. You're basically, when you're a PI and you get funded, congratulations. All that became your thing. It's always your fault. Even if it's not, it's always your fault. It's always yours to fix. And at the end, if any little bit of it goes wrong, it's on you. It's great. It's great. It's great. So that's the other way, if I can say, post-award support makes a difference in how that feels. Because the reality is there, it is your responsibility, but post-award support can make that less challenging over time.
Thank you, Cam.
Ilya, did you have another question? You said maybe one or two.
I think Cam covered some of it. I was going to ask. I was going to ask about what difference does it make if one is more conservative with budgets on a grant application. You sort of touched on it a little.
Yeah. Well, so on a grant application.
In other words, are you increasing your likelihood of getting the fund if you're offering a bargain?
No. It makes zero difference. What they will look at, because it's actually two separate processes, at least with NEH. So I should make that, the committee that's looking at your, they may have their suspicions and say, I'm not sure they can really do this, or they may say that, but they're not going to do a budgetary deep dive. Right. Once they say this is a good project, it goes to a different group of people that are staffers, and they go, all these things you asked for, you can't ask for them that way. And they will come back to you and say, we'll fund you if you make these adjustments to your budget. So think the value of the project first. You'll save yourself some time on the other side if you think through the budget piece carefully. And in the end, they do relate. If you're budgeting for student labor for work that doesn't need to get done, obviously it'll look weird. If you're budgeting all kinds of things for your time, but it's not really clear what your primary role is in needing that time, it'll look weird. If you're budgeting a ton of things for honorariums for people who haven't pledged they're going to do anything for your project, yeah, it's going to look weird. So your main goal there is to just to save yourself some headache after getting an award, if you get one, is to think through the categories and to always build in. There are certain categories that are flexible post-award and certain categories that are not. So your best bet is, if you're not sure if you're going to need money for X, put it in your budget. You can then move things from line A to line B. But if you don't have the line at all, if you've got nothing in the budget for something you realize you need, you will be absolutely out of luck, because the funders will say, you didn't ask for anything in this category. We're not going to create a category for you now. Too late. So be imaginative. Do you think you might need X? Put it in there, even if in a modest amount, because then you can always move money from a different part of it. Usually, once again, that's one of the administrative processes you'll have, is justifying the move from category A to category B in your budget. That's not like you can just wake up and do it, but you can't do it at all if you don't anticipate the need somewhere in the budget. So think of everything in advance, basically. Just don't be wrong about anything.
I'll follow up on a few things you said too, Cam. This has been the theme in previous sessions too. Folks doing these sorts of things, they are very comfortable with uncomfortable feelings. You mentioned the situation before submitting the grant, after receiving the grant, all that work, extra work for some people. And you also mentioned that the value it is attached for promotion and tenure and other things, recognition on campus. So what makes you to pursue these uncomfortable places rather than just hunkering down and as a full professor continuing as a comfortable arrangement? So what makes you to walk around in that uncomfortable area?
He likes a good challenge.
Well, there's a little bit of that. I mean, I do. I mean, you have to be someone who like, basically all the problems I just described are problems that usually can be solved, right? So I'm not asking you to do something, no one's being asked to do anything impossible, but it can be, and if you really hate fussing with that kind of stuff, maybe grant writing is not, and being a PI is not the thing you should do. Maybe a better role for you is to be a contributor to somebody else's grant, where you can be a consultant on their project, and then maybe over time you'll feel less terrified by the other parts that, I mean, you get that new job feeling, when you get a grant. It's like, oh boy, there's a whole bunch of stuff you don't know. I don't mind that, especially if I sort of trust that it'll probably work out, which is basically just male arrogance. That's all that is, right? So that's just, I think it's fine. I mean, when I didn't get that first NEH, the NEH grant, that with the two ones that I didn't get, they were digital humanities advancement grants. I applied twice. And the first time I applied for the lowest tier and got rejected. So what did I think? I applied for the higher tier. Like, I just didn't ask for enough money. That was the problem. I tried to fail up and it didn't work. So what makes me do it at all though? It's when I realize that there's no way I can do the thing I want to do unless I get. In other words, so really think about your local resources, optimize those as best you can. Think about who your collaborators are. Maybe you can make some headway before you go running out the door. I wouldn't have thought of doing that big initial project that I told you about, the one that became the Oxford book, if I didn't have these informal discussions with my two graduate student colleagues. That one was at my institution, one was at a different institution. We were just talking at conferences about a thing we wish existed, and we thought about doing it. And we kind of moved from the kind of sharing ideas phase to the, well, let's try, the napkin phase and everything else. And it wasn't like we woke up one day and decided to do it. We sort of moved towards it, and it seemed like a thing worth doing. If the project is worth doing, then what you do for the project in terms of the grant writing will be worth doing. But if your primary goal in getting a grant is to get promoted, or to get an article out, or to get money, you're going to be mostly disappointed. Because these projects take a while for the deliverables to really turn up, and sometimes when they deliver, they don't land with you don't get a parade and a Nobel Prize at the end. I mean, the project's done, good. What's next, right? Is what happens. So the work itself, I think, is and the necessities of the work, I think, is what drives it. And then if you do that, you'll mostly be able to put up with the parts that can be challenging. At least I found.
Thank you.
That's very helpful, actually.
Good.
Any questions? Anyone wants to bring up anything? Jay?
Oh, so yeah, Cam, Eunice, I have a question actually.
Sure.
So I have a follow-up comments regarding what you are talking about. Like I think a lot of scientists, a lot of researchers. So if like you just let them sit there and enjoy the life, and this may not be comfortable for them. Some of the researchers, they really enjoy like to test their ideas, spend time in the lab. So this is how they enjoy their life.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, so I think Cam is definitely one of those. And I actually have another question. So regarding the collaboration. So you mentioned you have grants, you definitely have collaborators, and also our campus is encouraging like interdisciplinary collaborations across the different colleges, right? So I don't not quite sure about your area and how you trying to manage proposal is interdisciplinary studies. And the other question is, I know you have a couple of collaborators in your publication, in your grants, and how you credited their contribution, and how you manage the funding, allocation, things.
These are great questions, and let me talk about the software project, because that was the one where I was very much, I mean, I could not code anything, right? I was the role I was really playing was I knew what I wanted, and I wanted other people to make it for me. You know, that's kind of, and so I was like the most annoying end user in the world. But I had, and what I could bring to the table was I could sort of say, in a content expertise area around Iranian studies and Persian language materials, what was working and what wasn't. The librarians I was working with who had coding expertise, and of course they understand the information management from the library perspective, they brought me to this whole world of what they were interested in. And it became clear to me as you were going that this tool was it could serve a particular project of mine, but it could serve, you know, it's like a shovel. You can use a shovel for a lot of things, you know. And so we were building a shovel. And when I realized we were building a shovel, I realized that I'm not a shovel engineer. These folks were. And so when we came down to registering the idea with the Office of Technology Transfer, the way I navigated it was I gave myself 20% credit for authorship. I gave the librarian did most of the coding, I think 30 or 40%. And then I gave the students who did the coding a certain percentage of authorship, so that if it ever became something where it would produce some sort of credit or income, first of all, they'll always get credit. They'll always get credit as authors of this software. That'll always be true. But if there's ever any kind of commercialization that happens, and they'll have a stake to it. The other way in which they manage the kind of how does this benefit everybody, I know with my specific content area in this software project what I could do in terms of an article, but the librarians would have maybe ideas about things they might publish in archiving journals or library science journals, and I might be a second or tertiary author on that, and that's how I can help them sort of develop their thing if they wanted to write it. So that's part of how you do it. Is you don't sort of, you sort of wind up being a junior character in their lead author projects. But for the thing itself, you just have to be realistic. I mean, could I do the project without them? No. Could they do the project without me? Yes, except that I had the funding. So capitalism, yay! But I brought the application. I brought the sort of conception, but I didn't bring the expertise to make it happen. And so portioning out that thing, we didn't decide that until later, because I don't think any of us realized it was going to be a project like that until very late in the game. We didn't think the tool was going to be a thing, and that was going to be beyond just my one narrow project. It was only after a couple of years that we realized its potential that way. And at that point, when I had to register the idea, which I knew I had to do for a variety of reasons, with Office of Technology Transfer, at that moment, I went out to them. I said, well, here's what I'm thinking in terms of credit. What do you guys think? And they were happy with that. So if they had said, no, Cam, you have 0 credit or whatever, that would have been a problem. But if they'd said, Cam, you should have 5%, I would have been like, yeah, okay, 5%. I can see that. Because what I was really trying to represent is that most of the ingenuity of the coding was them. Most of the connecting it to needs in library sciences was maybe a 50-50 split. And most of the connection to what an end user experience really needs, like me, that was me. So all of that was necessary for the thing to kind of develop the way it did. And how do you credit that is just, kind of fun to realize it. We began thinking about it like a music album. Who gets credit for production? Who gets credit for the instrumentals? That kind of a thing. So, that's how we sorted that. I'm not sure if I answered everything in your question there, but that was the piece I remembered from your question.
Yes, definitely. So thanks for sharing, Pam.
Yeah. And I will add, Office of Research is usually super helpful figuring these things out, even if you don't have any ideas. Let's say you have a collaborator in Indiana and another one in Seattle, and you guys want to work something, you want to be the PI, they need some equipment, or you want to pay them, you don't know how to do it, just ask Office of Research. This came up in previous meetings too. We have really good resources in that direction. Even our Dearborn colleagues, they are super good. They know lots of things really well. And if they have any thing they are not familiar with, they can reach out to their colleagues in Ann Arbor. And, you know, being the second largest external grant receiving institution in the United States, they know a lot of these tricks. So I feel really comfortable reaching out them with questions and just asking them to sort it out for us. Yeah,
you can get a lot done with subcontracts off of a grant, and I think if there's anything that I would say, especially if you want to get into an area where most grants don't let you build resources where you are, right? They kind of assume you have some. That's one of the things your institution is supposed to bring to the table, and that's one area where maybe depending on maybe in certain the sciences fields where we can't bring all the lab capacity or to the table the way another institution might. So being strategic about when you're going to be the subcontractor and when you're going to be the lead PI might also be a way for you to get in on some work that you otherwise would have a hard time working with. Where you know, because the grants generally won't, you know, build you a building or give you a computer or something. But if you can bring something else to the table, then maybe you're the right subcontracting institution. And that's, I think, something that our campus could do more with, because it always sounds better if, you know, we got the grant, right? But we help other people get grants. It's not a bad lane to be in either. Yeah.
Great. Any other questions for Kim?
I have one thing else I want to share about the Office of Technology Transfer. When I was filling out their paperwork, you can actually register an idea where you haven't done the thing yet. So if you want to get your idea for a time machine in with Office of Technology, theoretically, you can. It doesn't mean it'll do anything, but you can register. I have this idea. I didn't realize when they had their form, it was like, it can be very, very, very formative when you connect with them. I connected with that office after it was pretty clear the software was imminent, like, you know, we're within months of the software being released, and there are some questions that we had about that and how to do that. So
that's a very helpful tip. Thanks, Cam. And also the fact that you went through technology transfer. So anything that comes up in the college, folks asking me about that, I'll forward them to you, because I haven't done any technology transfer. Yeah, paperwork.
I thought Eunice was going to claim a part of the earnings.
Yes,
from the technology.
Yeah, I'll insert myself there too.
For the college, it would certainly help with the budget.
Yeah, I will be the guy putting his name on all the transfer agreements.
That's right.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Cam, for a very informative and also entertaining talk. Thanks everyone for joining us. I'll go ahead and stop the recording here.